Welcome to Restoration Seminar. For the students, I have an announcement. I have a couple of your graded summaries here with me. I'm sorry, last time it was again too busy. Whoever didn't send me those or didn't submit it to Moodle, they need to send it to me privately to my email. So please do it as soon as possible. And for Peter today, we will do a summary again. So don't wait for questions today, just try to do a summary on his talk. And any other, do you students have questions before we start? I try to pass those things while the talk, just really quietly in the background. Anybody has questions? I can't really pick the students, I'm just looking all over the place. So it's my pleasure today is to welcome Peter Lesica here. I should say, I hope I can say my old friend from Missoula, whom I got known in 2009 when I was over at the Fulbright, and I did lots of plant collections, surveyed sites, and I was actually lost in the native North American flora. And people just told me, well, why don't you see Peter? He probably can help you. And then I just went in, and sure enough, I got some bad words from Peter because my collections of plants was like plastic bags and just plants really not nicely put in, not really nice for for keying them out, but I tried to improve in that, and he was really right about that. So Peter Lesica is really important for me, and I think in the society who does botanizing in the US or basically worldwide. Before he starts his talk, I would introduce him. So Peter Lesica spent the past 40 plus summers botanizing across Montana. He's the author of the Manual of Montana Vascular Plants, which is the most current flora of Montana. I advise everybody who actually is dealing with plants, just get this. It's a huge work, and I actually work with plants too, and I know this is not something that you write overnight. It has data on just identification of plants, and the big thing about it, that it has all the distribution in Montana for counties. And it's really great to work with Peter on that.
Is that in the bookstore, Howard?
In the bookstore? I don't know if you have it in the bookstore, but in the library for sure. And you can still buy that, can't you, Peter?
Oh, sure.
So that's one of the big deal that Peter actually recently just published. And he's also author for the Flora of Glacier National Park and co-authored publications on Montana's rare plants, wetland plants, and alpine vegetation, as well as conducting vegetation ecology research throughout the state. He's an affiliate faculty at the University of Montana and the president of Conservation Biology Research. And he also is a lead person in the Montana Native Plant Society. I don't think anybody who is a member of the Native Plant Society would not know Peter. So Peter, I hope that was okay as for introduction. I know you love this.
Okay, is that going to be good enough?
We can make that as a projection. Oh, as for light?
Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you can see it. Everybody sees it?
Let's see. And I can just push it like this, right?
Would you like to have a slide insert?
Let's see. Maybe I can push it like that. Oh, it's not working off of it. So is this it here then?
I will come and help.
Oh, there I go. I got it. Okay, so I live in Missoula, and I spend time at the university there. So I sort of have this very Western Montana take on things. And most people over there in Missoula, and perhaps here too, when you think about big restoration problems in Montana, they think about riparian areas, which have been beat up for a century or more, and they think about forests, which are very overstocked due to fire suppression and that sort of thing. And that's when I'm in Missoula, that when people talk about restoration, that's what they talk about. But if you look at this map of Montana, a good half of the state is actually the Great Plains. And those problems are not really a problem over there. But that doesn't mean that there aren't restoration problems. And I'm going to talk today about what I think is the biggest restoration problem in eastern Montana. Okay, and so this has to start off with a little bit of history. So in right about the turn of the last century, right around 1900, 19-something, 05, something like that, the government, the United States government, opened up eastern Montana for homesteading. And so all kinds of people came out here to Montana and took 160 acres, or if they had a wife, they each took 160 acres, or if they had a wife and 2 kids, they took 640, you know, et cetera. And a huge portion of that country over there was homesteaded. And people, you know, when I work in eastern Montana, the ranchers tell me, oh, you know, the weather here, the climate sort of goes in 10-year cycles. And in the 1910s and most of the 1920s, we were in a wet cycle. And so those people that homesteaded, they broke the sod with horses and plows, by the way. So it was pretty much just the flat stuff that they broke. They planted it to grain, mostly to wheat, and they did pretty well because there was a lot of precipitation in those years. And then in 1914 and in that area, we had World War I, and so there were really good prices for wheat. So they did really well, and people came out and they farmed up a whole lot of that stuff. And then in the late 20s and through much of the 30s, it got dry. And they held on for a while, and pretty soon they couldn't hold on anymore. So they left. And they left these agricultural fields just as they were. And you can, if you look in history books and stuff, you can see pictures of Washington, D.C. in dust storms. And that dust, some of it came from eastern Montana. So it was really dry, and they were really losing soil, and that was a problem. So about the same time that this was being homesteaded, the Department of Agriculture, both here and up in Canada, were developing crested wheatgrass as a forage plant. And so they had that on hand when this happened. And I think there were 2 different bills that were passed. One of them was called the Bankhead-Jones one. I can't remember what the other one was called. But it gave the government bought back this land from these people for peanuts because they were gone, and land wasn't worth much with the soil eroding away. They bought back the land, and the Department of Agriculture tried to stabilize the soil, and they used crested wheatgrass for that. And at the time, there was just one cultivar, one form of crested wheatgrass. Now there are many. So I talked to somebody from the state office of BLM just a little while ago, and he said that and those lands that were reclaimed, let me see, actually, so here's a map. This is the Winnett country, and I'm sorry for the folds and everything, but that's how my maps are. So the blue is state, the white is private, the yellowish stuff is BLM that was always BLM, and the pink stuff are the LU lands, the land utilization lands, or as they are affectionately called, the Bankhead-Jones lands. That's the land that went back to the government after the people left. And you can see there's a lot of it. This is just one area near Winnett, which is up sort of north-central part of the state. The BLM guy told me that there are approximately 1.7 million acres of LU land, of Bankhead-Jones land, of which somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million acres are crested wheatgrass. So I got 3 of these here. So there's Opheim. Opheim is it's north of the High Line. It's way up near the Canadian border in the northeast corner of the state. Again, you can just see all the Bankhead-Jones land. And there's down by Terry, that's the Yellowstone River you can see flowing through there. And again, you see lots of this Bankhead Jones land. So right now, BLM has, on the order of 1.5 million acres of crested wheatgrass. Okay, well, there's some things. I mean, the reason the Department of Agriculture worked on developing cultivars of this, and the reason they planted it, well, there's a number of reasons. It really, you can plant it very easily. You can get it established very easily. It does really well in the eastern Montana climate, and in fact, I mean, it does even really well in southern Utah, which is a lot drier than eastern Montana. So it can take the drought. It resists weed invasions, and more than that, but that's a good thing about it. And in the spring and in the fall, in other words, in the non-growing, more or less the non-growing season, it's palatable. So, it's, I don't know how many of you guys pay attention to this kind of stuff, but like crested wheatgrass is like blue bunch wheatgrass in that it will put up new growth in October or November. And, like the hill behind my house, the elk love that stuff that comes up in October and November all through the winter. And then on into, maybe March or April, it's palatable. But then, certainly starting in mid-May or late May and on through the summer is completely unpalatable. So, ranchers, if they have enough of it, if they don't have too much of it, they're fine with it because they use it for spring and winter pasture. If they've got a lot of it, they're not too happy about it. So, but those are good things, and that's what they planted. But there's some problems with it too. So here's a picture of what a crested wheatgrass field in eastern Montana looks like, a broad scale, and it sort of looks like a nice kept lawn, except that it's a little taller. There's what a close-up looks like. There's very little in there besides crested wheatgrass. Now, I'm showing you sort of an extreme example. In some cases, it's not that bad. There'll be some stuff there. But it's amazing to me that after 80 years that these fields, so all of these fields that I've studied, everything I'm going to talk to you about is Bankhead Jones. So it was planted in the 30s, and it was all planted to fairway cultivar. And it's amazing how these fields, after 80 years, still look like a monoculture. They still look like, almost like a wheat field. It's sort of mind-blowing. Anyhow, there are some things that are bad about crested wheatgrass. Okay, I put the first one first. Because right now, so for example, if Robert or some other people want to write a proposal to get some money to do this kind of restoration, you have to say one thing: sage-grouse. Sage-grouse is huge in eastern Montana. So sage-grouse don't use crested anywhere near as much as they use native sagebrush grasslands. There's a whole lot of other birds that don't care for it either. There's also a whole lot of, it's just the biological diversity of those crested wheatgrass fields is just really low. The other word that you want to say in your proposal is pollinators. And because you don't hardly have any forbs out there, there aren't very many pollinators either. So, now that we're in this more enlightened stage where we actually care about biological diversity, it's becoming apparent to people that crested wheatgrass is not that great. I should point out that there's a lot more crested wheatgrass in eastern Montana than just the Bankhead Jones land. I'm going to say about 20 years ago, the federal government came up with the Conservation Reserve Program. And for about the first 5 years or so, before conservation organizations like the Native Plant Society got on their case, they and this was, the idea was that they would let people take marginal cropland and put it into grass. And that would help wildlife and it would also cut back on the surplus of grains that we had. So they actually paid ranchers and farmers to go out there and plant their crop fields to crested wheatgrass. So there's a lot of that out there too. Now, if they want to do that, I'm not even sure the Conservation Reserve Program is still going, but if they want to do it now, they have to use natives. But back then when it started, they could plant it to crested wheatgrass, and a whole lot of people did. So it was a very ill-conceived, or maybe it was a good idea, but they didn't think it through, or they didn't talk to the people out here. So, but anyhow, I'm only dealing with the Bankhead Jones land. Okay, so here is what a native, in fact, these are all from the same site. Those two I showed you before, and this one, this is a native site. And you know, if you look closely, well, let's look at a close-up here. So there's a few more forbs, and actually in most of these there are a fair number of forbs, but there's also several different grasses in there. In this picture, there's actually a little bit of crested right in the middle of it. But right next to it, there's some western wheatgrass, and there's some blue grama in there, and probably some other things as well. So this is the same site, but it's on the other side of the plow line. Okay, so nowadays, I think most people acknowledge that it would be really good if we could restore crested wheatgrass fields to something resembling native, or at least something that's a little more diverse than these monocultures. But there's a problem, and that is you can't get rid of the crested wheatgrass very easily. And there's, so this Bach Sol guy is a professor at MSU. I think he's still there, maybe he's retired. But anyways, he and one of his students did a literature review. And they pretty much found out that nobody has had very good luck getting rid of this. People have herbicided it 4 years in a row, and the stuff still comes back from a seed bank. It has a very, very persistent seed bank. People have plowed it and then herbicided it. It still doesn't work. You know, there's probably some way of doing it, but it's probably pretty expensive. And if you've got 1.5 million acres of this stuff, you're probably not going to be able to do something that expensive. So what's really going on is we need to figure out how to treat these fields so that we can at least, we're not going to eradicate crested wheatgrass, but we need to figure out a way to at least make them more diverse, at least make them better for wildlife and pollinators and sage grouse. Okay, so the study I'm going to talk to you about, or I'm going to tell you about, is actually, I think, a no-brainer. I mean, this is not, you know, this is not cutting-edge science. I am not pushing back the frontiers of science or anything. If I asked you, you know, what plants would coexist with crested wheatgrass? Let's say we're going to go out there and spray it, and then herbicide it, and then we're going to plant some natives, and then of course the crested's going to come back. But what plants should we put out there that can coexist with crested wheatgrass? I think what you would say is, well, let's go out and look. And that's just what we did, except we did it in a systematic, quantitative way. So we just didn't walk around, you know, and look at the ground and take a few notes. We actually did it in a quantitative way. But otherwise, it's a very simple idea. It's not a big deal. But in fact, what we tried to come up with was a list of species that would seed in and that would be able to coexist with crested wheatgrass when it came back. So it's sort of like, you know, we're trying to hedge our bets here. Okay, so one of the things, like if you read the ecological literature, it would tell you that if you have two things with the same growth form, or if you're into modern jargon, the same functional group, they're going to compete more strongly with each other than two plants that are different, have different growth forms. Okay, so you know, what that would suggest, maybe, is that if you have a field of green needlegrass, which is a native cool season bunch grass, just like crested wheatgrass is, In a situation like that, you might think that the green needlegrass would compete more strongly with the crested wheatgrass, and because it was established, it would be able to keep it out or at least minimize it. On the other hand, if you're planting something into the crested wheatgrass, you're not going to get there if you plant something that's the same, if you plant green needlegrass. What you want is something that's different. Now that's the theoretical, that's the ecological expectation. And we're going to find out if that's true. The other thing that's important to consider is the pollinators. So you want to have, when you plant these fields, if you're interested in pollinators, you want to have things that bloom early, things that bloom in the middle of the season, and things that bloom late. Again, it's kind of a no-brainer. Okay, so there's a map of that part of Montana. People in Missoula, they don't. This could be in New York as far as they know, but maybe a little further east, like in Butte, people know where this stuff is. Let's see. So this Charles Russell Wildlife Refuge is just to the north of this map. Oh, and look at that, there's Billings. I'm sure you know where Billings is. So that's where that is. This study was funded by the Lewistown District of the Bureau of Land Management. And so most of those dots, most of those blue dots up there, most of our study sites are on the Lewistown District. In order to get a couple of sites that had a little bit sandier soil, we went down into the Billings District and did a few plots down there, took a few sites down there. But in general, I would say that our results and what I'm going to tell you about mostly apply to northeastern Montana, where the parent materials tend to be marine shales, and probably is a little less applicable, maybe a lot less applicable, to further south where the parent materials tend to be sandstone. And I'll talk a little, well, maybe I'll talk about it right now. Yeah, so in all of these, whenever we went to a site, so BLM gave us, the way we did this is BLM gave us, we went in and we asked and we said, look, we need sites that are this Bankhead Jones stuff that's adjacent to native, that has some adjacent native prairie that's never been broken right next to it. And of course, we need somebody where the permittee isn't going to get uptight. And they gave us about 35 sites or so. And then we randomly chose 20 of them to sample. And we took a soil sample, both from the crested field and from the native, and we measured it for sand, silt, and clay. And what we found was that the soils, what we found first of all was that and this you'd expect, that the sand and the silt and the clay, the sand is very strongly negatively correlated with silt and clay. That's just what you'd expect. We found that sand was probably the best, sand was the one that was bimodally distributed. And so we just chopped it in half, the distribution in half, and the sandy soils have less than 50%, sandy soils have more than 50% sand. The heavy soils have less than 50% sand. So it's really a continuum, and we split it when I talked about heavy and light soils, that's where this comes from. But it is a continuum. And like I said, I don't think that we got as light a soils as we could have, and we certainly didn't get as many light soils as we could have if we had done the whole eastern part of the state instead of just northeastern part. Okay, so this is the study design. So this is our macro plot, and within the macro plot we have 4 sample plots, which they each go out from the center. This is the center right here, and then we went out on a compass bearing at a randomly selected, randomly determined distance, and that's how we located our sample plots. And then so we took canopy cover of everything, estimated canopy cover in those 4 sample plots, and then we actually measured the density. and frequency of all the plants, all the native plants that were invading the crested. In those 1 meter squared microplots, we're calling them. So you get 12 microplots per sample plot. And there's a sample plot within 50 meters. So this distance, if this is the plow line right here, the edge of this is within 50 meters of that plow line. And so this is the crested plot. And then over here, there would be a native plot, and it would also be within 50. So a lot of times, so the most that could ever be would be 100 apart. The edges would be 100 apart, but usually they were less. Usually, it was more like 50, 60, 70 apart. Okay, so that's where the data come from. Let's see. Okay, so the grasslands were dominated by, let's see, what do you think, Robert? Do people know scientific names, or should I use common names?
I would use common names.
Okay, so these grasslands were primarily dominated by western wheatgrass, thick spike wheatgrass, needle and thread, sandberg bluegrass, and blue grama. Quite a few, well, probably less than half, but quite a few of them had Wyoming big sagebrush. And common forbs included yarrow, that's not it, textile onion. Oh boy, no, I'm bad on common names. What's Selaginella called? Oh well. Selaginella densa, dandelions were actually quite common, and then American vetch was also very common. Okay, and here's how this is, you're going to see these data shortly. Old-time plant ecologists have, 3 ways of measuring how common something is. So you can have frequency, which is, the number over the possible number. So it's kind of like a percent. And relative density is the same way, and then dominance is by canopy cover. So density, you just cover you count, there's a meter squared thing, and I count how many dandelions are in there. Except we didn't do dandelions, but how many onions are in there, 1, 2, 3, sort of thing. And then the canopy cover was measured in those larger plots. But the density and the frequency come from the microplots, and the canopy cover comes from the sample plot. And then people back in the old days when they were describing vegetation, use what's called an importance value, which is just the summation of those 3. And that gives you an idea of how important those plants are in that community. Are they just minor components, or are they major components? Okay, so first of all, because we're going to talk about soils, we wanted to know whether soils in the native part of that study site were the same as they were in the crested. In other words, did plowing it and planting it to crested, and did that erosion that happened before it was planted to crested, did that in fact change the way the soil was? Did it change the texture of the soil? And we found that it did not. So that made it a lot easier. Okay, the other thing we found, which you saw in those photos, is that the canopy cover of native plants declined as the canopy cover of crested wheatgrass increased. So some of these plots were, some of these sites, the crested was thicker than others, and it's a continuum. I mean, some of these sites had been reinvaded by natives to a greater extent than others. It's what you would expect. Okay, one of the things we wanted to know was, how did soil texture affect the crested wheatgrass? And what we found is basically that crested likes the heavier soils. And none of these are really clay soils. They're silty soils. So crested liked silty soils better than it liked loamy soils. And what that meant was that it's denser out there where you've got silty soils where it was plowed up and planted, but it also means that it invades the natives more where the soil is siltier compared to loamier or sandier. So that's important to know. Now, what we said about that was that for these reasons, for those two reasons, 3 and 4, you want to prioritize sites, prioritize crested plantings that are on silty soils, because that's where you're going to get invasion from into the natives, and you want to protect the natives that you have, and so you want to try to get rid of where those places where crested wheatgrass is going to be the most aggressive. Interestingly enough, this has been submitted to peer review, and one of the reviewers, who was a very good reviewer, because they weren't all very good, but this guy was very good, and he actually, I could tell, and just from the review, that he was somebody that actually did this stuff. You know, he actually had dirt under his fingernails. And he said, well, yes, I understand what you're saying, he said, but I do this for a living, and I want to succeed. And what your information tells me is that I got a better chance of succeeding if I do it on the lighter soils. And he's right. So it kind of depends on how you know, if you're just looking at, I want to have success, then maybe you want to pick out the ones with lighter soils. If you're worried about invasion and you're worried about, you know, polluting your native, the stuff that's still native, then you probably want to go with the heavier soils. So, you know, the result actually can point to two different management, has two different management ways of looking at it. Okay, so I don't know if how well you guys, especially way in the back, can see that. But this is so on the heavy soil, this is what came about, what our results look like. So they're in 3 groups, and they go from in declining order of importance value. So Artemisia tridentata sagebrush was actually, of the 3, you know, there aren't a whole lot of shrubs out there, but of the 3 shrubs, it was by far the best one. And you know, it's broken down also into frequency density, and you know, I'm not going to go through all of this because that would just be sort of boring, I think. So let's see what comes next here. Okay, and there's the light soil. So we got this, and from this, we believe you can, this can inform your seed mix. By knowing this stuff, by knowing what kind of soil you're planting on, and you can use this list to help you come up with a seed mix. The other thing that you want to consider is that pollination thing. And so the preferred plants, okay, so I didn't point this out, but I'll say it now, that as far as the shrubs go and the grasses go, there wasn't much difference between heavy soils and light soils. And probably an interesting thing about that is, so the Agropyron smithii, the western wheatgrass, is rhizomatous. And the other one, the one at the end, Bouteloua gracilis, is also rhizomatous. And Bouteloua gracilis is a warm season grass. So those are the 2 that are different, have a different growth form than crested wheatgrass. And they were 2 of the 4 best grasses for a mixture. But the other 2, the June grass, Coleria macrantha, and needle and thread, Stipa comata, are both cool season bunch grasses. So this kind of negates our hypothesis that it would be different growth forms would do best. It just wasn't really true. I mean, some of it, yeah, it just didn't seem to necessarily be very strictly true. So you don't want to use that. At least in this case, it didn't really work. 2 of the different ones, different growth forms were great, and 2 of the same growth forms were great. Okay. And of course, sagebrush was the shrub you want to go with. Okay, so with heavy soil, so this is a list that I made up using those bigger lists. For the forbs, these are some of the ones that had the highest importance value. But I picked out ones so that we would have some earlies, we'd have some early to mid or mid, and then we would have a couple, or at least one late flowering species. So this is taking into consideration what does well with crested wheatgrass, and also what's going to bloom and provide nectar and pollen for pollinators. And this list is pretty different than this one for the light soil ones. So the one that's the same is this one. Vicia americana, American vetch, was always in those crested wheatgrass fields. I don't know why, but it was. And it was always quite abundant. But these other ones, for the most part, are different than the ones that were in heavy soils. So what our research showed is that there are, as far as forbs go, there are definitely some differences that you'd want to have in your seed mix depending on the soil texture that you were working with. And again, I picked out ones where there are some early, some mid, and some late season ones. But if you were doing this, you might, there are some other things, like maybe it's hard to get seed of Cerastium arvense. Maybe that is a drag. And it's hard to harvest, or the capsules, whatever. So there are other considerations too, which since I don't know about cultivating and gathering seed of these, that's where you'd go to the Plant Materials Center in Bridger, and you'd start asking them questions. But for those two ways of looking at it, both who coexists with crested and who's going to support pollinators, these are the lists that I came up with. And that, I think, is pretty much all I have to say about this. Like I said, it wasn't a terribly groundbreaking study or anything, but everybody that I've talked to about this said, oh yeah, we need to know this, because we're going to try to go out and replant this stuff. So hopefully it'll work. Maybe someday somebody will figure out how to eradicate crested wheatgrass, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, and I don't think BLM is ever going to have the money to do any expensive eradication. I think the best they're going to be able to do is a couple of years of treatment and then seed it and move on. So that's all I have. Thanks for listening.
I think there are questions for Peter, if someone has.
Yeah.
You mentioned ranchers don't like having too much crested wheatgrass. If you talk to any of them, do they have any strategies that they
First of all, they can't do anything because it's federal land. So if you're a permittee, you can't go out there and plow that up. You'll get in big trouble. So I don't know that any of them have really thought about that. It is interesting that I know some ranchers that have a little bit of crested wheatgrass and they like it. They think it's fine because they can put their cows out in the spring and they can put their cows out late in the fall, and it's just fine. But I know other ranchers that have, or I've talked to other ranchers that have a lot of it, and they hate it. And you go out there in their fields and they're untouched. They're just, what the cows do is hang out in the riparian areas and just eat everything there and just blow off the whole crested wheatgrass scene. So, it really depends on, every ranch is different, but a whole lot of ranchers out there don't like this stuff because the livestock won't touch it during the summer. Yeah.
Does it become more bitter during the summer?
I'm guessing it becomes tougher, But I honestly don't know the answer to that. I just know that when it's tender and it's just coming up, in the spring, or when it's regrowing in the fall and it's tender, that they'll eat it. But once the plant is sort of fully formed and it's starting to bolt, they won't touch it. Yeah. Robert?
So I also would like to ask a question considering the soils. Did you take any measurements, or do you know anything about its nutrient?
No. We did take pH and salinity, but they didn't really make a whole lot of difference. So no, I don't.
Salinity not either.
I'm sorry?
Salinity didn't make a difference either.
No, but I mean, we may not have had a very great, I'm sure if you got some really heavily saline soils, there'd be something going on, but they may not even have crested, because those are not the kind of soils that people would have farmed.
Yeah. So back in Hungary, we have crested wheatgrass. We talked about that as a native plant, and it's kind of a rare plant. And it's because its habitat is actually just focused on the more flat and saline environment back in Hungary, and it forms these vegetation types together with chamomile and this guy, and it's a rare type of habitat that we were. I saw crested wheatgrass back like 2 times in my life in Hungary, because it's not the area where I lived. So whenever I went there, I would just, wow, crested wheatgrass, take the pictures.
Yeah, I can see you pulling out your camera now, Robert.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I believe it's true that Fairway, came from Siberia, which is fairly far from Hungary. I don't know about some of these newer cultivars, and another good question would be: do these newer cultivars behave the same way? And in fact, there are some agristologists who divide crested wheatgrass into 2 species. So there's that whole taxonomy quagmire too, and we just tried to avoid that. We were doing it for BLM. Their stuff is almost all Fairway, so we didn't worry about it. But that is another issue. Yeah, right.
But Mark Mariano is one of our grad students here. He actually, just a week before you, he actually had a presentation on the issues of crested wheatgrass here in Butte, and all kinds of different.
Yeah. Well, there's a guy, actually 2 guys, Jim Richards, who was in Utah. Now he's I think he's still at Davis, although he might be retired. And they did a huge number of studies on crested wheatgrass, all in the Intermountain area, not the Great Plains. But and I think they may have looked at different cultivars of it. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I haven't looked into that. I know that mess exists, but I haven't looked at it. I haven't looked into it. Yeah.
Well, getting back to the question of soil texture, and really possibly its application here in Butte. We do have a lot of crested wheatgrass on our reclaimed sites.
Right.
We also have very light soils, because it's a granite.
Yeah, it would be different. It'd be very different.
And so maybe your results aren't applicable to
I would say they're probably not.
Okay.
Not only that, but yeah, your soils are light, but they're also probably sort of almost gravelly, whereas, yeah. So I think I doubt that would be the same. And this is not very far west of the divide, but this is west of the divide, and actually a lot of those species, like, I don't know, do you ever see Astragalus missouriensis over here, for example? That's common as dirt over in eastern Montana, but I don't think it's here very much, if at all. So a lot of the species you don't even have here. So yeah, I don't think Robert got me over here because he thought this was going to help.
I did, actually.
Did you really? Oh, well, yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Well, I was just,
Everything else.
And I was just thinking about your friend who said, I like this because it shows that I'm looking for the places I can see success.
Right.
So I'm wondering we might expect even greater success because we have such well-drained soils.
Yeah, no, I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to do a very similar study to find out what's going on. And I mean, the other thing is that when was your stuff planted? You know, it might be a different cultivar. So,
There are a couple of them.
yeah. See, so I mean, in one way, for a lot of people, what this does is it gives you an example of maybe what you need to do if you want to develop a seed mix. Yeah.
The three grow, you're talking to me.
Wait, who?
I'll go.
Go ahead. Go for it.
It's on the same topic, that's otherwise.
Okay.
So the point that Joe makes is true about our natural soils, but usually where our crested is on caps that were capped with Bozeman and flats, really silty soils. So it's heavy.
Yeah, if that's true.
But then my question is, what I've been studying as a graduate student here is specifically in Butte, and I don't know if it's because of our local climate or if this is something you observed on the plains, but we get a monster litter buildup. So I did an average litter 200 measurements, and I got 7.3 or 7.6 centimeters on the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice that?
Yeah, there's a lot of litter buildup in those stands as well. You know, and it does depend on whether the rancher is grazing them at the appropriate time of year. Then it knocks, you know, it keeps the litter, it detracts from the litter. But yeah, it is. And you know, this stuff is. I mean, there's a huge amount of literature on this, and a lot of the peer-reviewed literature comes from a guy named Scott Wilson, who's up in Saskatchewan. And they really hate crested wheatgrass up there. And you know, they have all of these papers where crested wheatgrass is just invading all over the place, and they just hate it and all that. And you know, we didn't find it invading the native stuff very much in our studies. But I've talked to others, so down around Terry, I know a rancher, and he hates crested because it invades all of his native stuff. So, you know, these results don't apply all over the place, that's for sure. You know, the part that they do apply to is still probably, you know, 500,000 acres, which isn't trivial. But, you know, you gotta, yeah, and I mean, I'm sure they don't apply in Utah. I'm sure they don't apply in Eastern Washington. But it's just sort of like an interesting little happening. And, you know, maybe some of you someday will actually go on the other side of the divide, you know. And, yeah.
So the litter, there's potentially heavy litter from the crested wheatgrass, that must make chemical or other changes in the soil that would influence the ability of native species to get started and succeed there. And you know, if so, what is that that's maybe doing that?
I guess I don't really know the answer to that. My guess is like over here. So I do work in the western part of the state a fair amount, and a lot of it is in grasslands that are dominated by rough fescue, and rough fescue also produces a lot of litter, and you do get better. Things recruit better if you burn off that litter. So the litter does have some effect. You know, one of the things that the literature tells, the literature will talk about the fact that crested wheatgrass, and I've seen contradictions on this, but the studies that I believe the most have shown that crested wheatgrass puts more biomass above ground, but less below ground, so that it actually isn't that it's not as good as native vegetation for building soil and for sequestering carbon, because of course the litter eventually just goes back into the air, but if it's sequestered below ground from the roots, it stays in there and it becomes organic matter, and you've built up that organic matter, and that helps both helps make the soil richer, but also helps with you know, climate change stuff. So.
One last question.
Okay, one last question.
So it's getting time. So actually you talked about different forests and grasses and some of your artemisia. Do you think it would be worth to outcompete the crested wheatgrass with other type of woody vegetation? And I know on those grasslands, probably where you were, that was not a historic environment. There were not maybe big pine or spruce woods before, but here there were.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be a kind of an approach? Could that work? Could that
Planting trees? Is that what you're saying?
Okay.
Maybe around here. I don't. I guess I'd have to know what the sites were. I mean, one of this stuff. Remember I started off this talk by talking about history, and I'm really into historical ecology. I find that a lot of ecologists don't pay any attention to what happened out there. I mean, I could tell you all kinds of stories where I learned something by talking to some old rancher, who could tell me what actually went on that piece of ground. And I think it'd be the same here. You'd have to ask, like, what used to be here? And whether you can answer that or not, I don't know. But, it'd be worth looking into that kind of thing. So I don't know. I haven't worked right around.
If that is a potential vegetation type, then we might have a good chance to substitute it.
Well, you could, I don't know if anybody's ever tried shading it out, because all of the studies that I know occur in grasslands, in grassland environments. So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've seen there's studies from eastern Washington, studies from Utah, studies from Saskatchewan, places, but I just don't know about. I would think that you could shade it out. I mean, if you got a good stand of spruce trees, boy, that would shade everything out, You could change it into moss.
It does not really like to be shaded, that's for sure.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Anyways, thank you.
Okay. All right, one more?
Okay, thank you.
All right, all right, thank you.